Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you, Tim, for giving me first word as I basically sabotage you into doing. I just want to start by saying what an absolute privilege and an honour it is to be doing this tonight. This is the first event of the tour, so you guys are all genuinely part of the launch. Good on you for being here. And it just blows my mind that I've got a room full of people coming to hear about my book. I've got people I don't know, which is amazing. I've got people I do know, a lot of them, guys I haven't seen in ages, high school friends, some titans of engineering, got the MSF crew, got my wonderful publishing crowd, and I've got my family. I've got my wonderful mum, Mary Jane, who's sitting in the front row, loves to be in the spotlight and talking to strangers, so you should definitely all go and talk to her. Her husband David, my stepsister Sarah, her fiancé Robert. So amazing experience. And I'm sitting next to bloody Tim Flannery. For anyone who hasn't had the honour of hanging out with Tim Flannery, he's the kind of guy that you catch up with for a beer and then you say, what have you been up to, mate? It's like, oh, not much. I mean, I did go to Solomon Islands and help bring peace to a couple of tribes that have been warring for generations. And I wrote what I thought was a long overdue treatise on the evolutionary biology of the platypus and the echidna, but apart from that, not much. So, as you know, Tim, I've been a huge fan of yours since I was in high school, got all of your books, basically, and it's an honour to be, a friend, and you've been a huge supporter of this book right from the beginning, so thanks a million for being here tonight as well.
Well, thanks so much, Lachlan. You've embarrassed me now, though. You put me off my stride. But, look, could I just say, I don't do these events very often, but I really wanted to do this one because I think we lucky few who are here this evening are at the beginning of a great journey, because Lachlan McIver's book it addresses very directly one of the great issues of our time, which is equity between people, particularly health outcome equities between people. And unless we solve this problem that Lachlan's been working at for so long, we won't have a future. We need to do that. We need to make sure that economic equity is shared better. We need to address climate change, and we need to make sure that biodiversity is protected. That is the mission for our generation. So I'm very pleased to be here this evening, Lachlan, to be part of this discussion. And I wanted to just start, and I'm going to drill down a bit relentlessly, if you don't mind.
Let's do it.
I just wanted to start at the beginning. There you are. You're a dairy farmer's son up in Millamilla, I guess.
Well, beef farmer's son. We're a little island of beef and an ocean of dairy.
Right, fair enough. Okay, well that would have been a position of disadvantage, I imagine. But anyway, at least you didn't have to milk 8 hours a day.
Yeah, I'm happy to have dodged that bullet, honestly. Yeah, with apologies to all my extended family who are dairy farmers.
Right, fair enough. So there you are. You discover your father at the age of 16 on the side of the road. Can you take us through that early part of the journey that made you what you are today, I guess?
The context of that, and it's really special to have these guys in those hairy dudes in that road, because they were in my life, a big part of my life at the time. So I'd just come back from Russia, of all places. Right? I was this kid from Millamilla. It's Millamilla, Dan, not Manila. God damn it. Just back from Russia, we've been kicking around with cosmonauts and doing this wild stuff as these up and coming science nerds, and so I was really riding on a high, and I get back home and 2 weeks later, Dad just drops dead, and so our life changed instantly and forever, and in the most profoundly dramatic fashion. So, okay, I may be taking a little bit of literary liberty to say, in that moment, like I had this kind of, dirt road to Damascus moment and became a doctor, but it definitely pushed me a lot further down that road that I've maybe been contemplating in terms of doing medicine. And I think subconsciously, in amongst that grief and outrage of that experience, like, just, why the hell could this happen? How could this happen? Why me? Why us? Why now? And why here? And how, in these kind of circumstances, can someone just drop dead with no medical kind of attention or connection or anything. And so that, I guess, in a way, added to the fact that I'm from a very rural area, and so I guess have that sort of blood running through me, was what led to me going to med school and ultimately realising, after I sort of took the scenic route, realising that rural medicine was actually a career. It was a specialty. It was a path that I could take. Here I am.
Right. Okay. And so then you did some work around Australia, but you also went into the Pacific. So tell us about that part of the journey. Where did you go? What did you encounter? What was it like for you?
Giving a shout out to my Pacific crew, who are also here, not all of them, but a couple of the gang from Fiji also here. Thanks for coming, guys. That was a real sharp right turn for me career-wise. I was working up in the Torres Strait, finishing my training in rural and remote medicine, doing the study and working my backside off and preparing for my exams and all that, but knowing that there was this sort of feeling in my bones that I wanted to go and get into global health, whatever the hell that was. I didn't have a very specific shape, but I had this sort of itch that I needed to scratch. And I always had thought up until that point in time that would mean MSF, right? Doctors Without Borders. And I might have even put in a sort of like a half-assed application at that time, but wasn't quite clear about what I wanted to do. But by then, I had been sort of sucked into environmental health, because when I was working in public health in the Kimberley, became interested in and frankly concerned about this relationship between weather and climate and infectious diseases. I was researching Ross River virus at the time, and I was like, Jesus Christ, why is this not a more widely understood and more effectively addressed problem? Like, this is big news. This is a big deal. And even in the field of public health, I was like, health impacts of climate change is not something that we're really hearing about. Do they all know something I don't know, or do I know something that not enough people know? And it really was a very tricky kind of intellectual step for me to go, actually, I think I've got the inside mail here, and it's not good news. So I had dabbled a bit in that kind of research, and that was still in the back of my mind as I'm thinking, okay, how do I get into global health? And then just, kind of borderline miraculously, this job came up with the World Health Organization in the South Pacific, working on climate change and health. So personally, I don't think I was particularly qualified for the job, but they gave me a whack at it, and yeah, that led to me spending a couple of years living in Fiji, working on this regional project, helping a dozen different Pacific Island countries try and figure out what the risks were that they were facing in relation to climate change and health. And in fact, not just facing in a future sense, but like facing right now, facing already, dealing with it for generations. And so that was, pretty hardcore introduction into health impacts of climate change that, led to PhD and then further work with WHO and whatnot.
But Lockie, I've been into those villages too.
Yeah.
I know as a white bloke, you go in there, or white person, you go in there, everyone thinks that you're the solution to everything, you know everything, right? So I remember I was just doing biological survey in these remote areas, but every morning there'd be a line of people wanting some treatment. And I hardly knew an aspirin from a vitamin pill. I was trying to help people, the best I could. Yeah. But for you, it would have been different. Tell me what it was like for you in that situation.
Yeah, look, maybe things have moved on a teeny bit. I'm not trying to point out our age difference here, Tim.
That's all right, Lockie. You go for it, mate. It's good.
Tiptoeing around that. But my experience in the Pacific was a bit more, I'd say, of a partnership in terms of figuring out what these problems were. Like, I really pushed back against that kind of white saviour trope.
So did I, to no avail. I'm afraid.
Yeah, and so look, what I was working on was really about learning from my colleagues in the Pacific about, okay, what has been your lived experience of sea level rise, and what does that mean for your water and soil and food? What has been your experience of extreme weather events, cyclones, droughts, floods? What has been your experience of chronic diseases, cardiovascular, respiratory disease, and how that changes when it's really hot, for example? And they know perfectly well that things are getting hotter and the sea's rising and the storms are more frequent. So it was a real kind of collaborative effort to figure out what their observations and experiences meant in terms of what we could see from the science, and then make that next step of saying, okay, so what in the screaming blazes are we going to be doing about it in the context of the Pacific, very limited resources.
Right, okay. So that is a different experience, I guess, to what I saw in the Pacific. But were you ever in a position of being a doctor who was actually asked to treat someone? Right.
So there's kind of this parallel story that is about rocket ship. Yeah. So as I was tootling around the Pacific, thanks for setting me up for that, by the way. As I was, swanning around the Pacific, I mean, having a great time, but also doing some pretty depressing work, quite frankly. Or at least the topic was depressing, the implications were depressing. But coming from my background as a rural journalist and having been quite involved with the Australian College of Rural and Remote Medicine already by that stage on the board and as a medical educator and stuff, I had seen behind the curtain at what rural medical training or training for rural health professionals looks like in the Australian context, and had also learned the history of that. It's like, so why do we have a College of Rural and Remote Medicine in Australia? Because we have had a crisis of rural health in Australia for decades. And there was this realisation that, Jesus, we're creating too many specialist doctors and not enough of them can go and work in the bush and do a bit of everything. So there had been this sort of recognition and establishment of this specialty college, and there's all the system support that you need around that, including political support and funding, and then people to actually be willing to do the job. And as I was, jumping from country to country, island to island, community to community around the Pacific, I could see that actually it's a bit similar. It's kind of history repeating. In the Pacific, these are mostly rural communities who have too few doctors. The doctors they do have are far too concentrated in the cities, the capitals, and most of the health needs are in rural areas. So, yes, I ended up kind of working as a rural doctor, but also working alongside rural doctors and nurses and health workers in these often very remote and typically extremely under-resourced communities, and go, well, we've got to do something about this as well. So kind of at the tail end of my time with WHO in the Pacific, I'd gotten to know some of the ministers of health and directors and the senior clinicians, the influencers, if you like, and I was starting to just sort of chat to them about, look, we've had this experience in Australia of creating this rural generalist model, and they might have some application in your countries, and they're like, shit, yeah, let's do it. So that's how Rocket Ship was born, and we ended up establishing this organisation specifically to support the training of doctors to be able to work in rural communities and provide that kind of spectrum and quality of care that rural communities so desperately need, but typically don't have really anywhere in the developing world.
So there you are at the age of in your 20s somewhere.
Yeah.
So you've had this incredible experience. You've set up a major organisation that's going to have impacts on people's lives.
Major might be overstating it, but
well, no. I mean, Lockie, could I just say, for anyone in a village who is sick, who needs some help, that is major. I mean, I don't know whether people understand how bad the situation can be in the Pacific for people who need medical attention. I've met women who have had 14 kids. They're terribly undernourished. The pressure on them is enormous. Another pregnancy is likely to kill them, and they can't get the pill.
Yeah,
they can't get any sort of contraception. So you know what that's like. You know that it's tough on people. So Rocket Ship is actually going to be helping, and has helped a lot of people.
Yeah, look, I'm maybe taking a bit of poetic license in describing it like this, but the Rocket Ship was really launched, forgive the clumsy kind of metaphor, in the aftermath of Cyclone Pam. So in early 2016, this Category 5 cyclone tore into Vanuatu after having already torn through the Solomon Islands and Tuvalu en route. I think second worst cyclone in recorded history in the Pacific, and the worst in Vanuatu. And so I was already kind of in cahoots with the Ministry of Health there. Rocket Ship was in the early stages. I had this job that I've been requested to do to basically help set up a junior doctor training program in Vanuatu, because they had these new graduates returning from Cuba. Cuba's the largest medical school in the world. A lot of developing countries send young people to train there. And so this was sort of about to happen. And then the cyclone happened. And so as a rural generalist, kind of in Vanuatu or connected to Vanuatu, they're like, we need you. I was like, sure, what do you want me to do? They're like, we need you to be in the emergency department of our national referral hospital. I was like, cool. How many other doctors are there? They're like, just you. And so like that blew my mind as well. I'm like, hang on, you mean there's no emergency physicians in Vanuatu? Like, no such thing. So I was like, well, that's a problem as well, but we'll deal with that later. So yeah, I found myself sort of thrust into this very tricky position of being the kind of main and often the only doctor in the emergency department of the National Referral Hospital after the worst disaster to hit the country ever, trying to deal with a bit of everything in a country that usually doesn't have a lot of resources and is now just basically broken, but also at the same time weirdly being inundated with all this stuff, all this goodwill and people and stuff from well-meaning individuals and organisations who are just trying to help, to be fair. But little country, little health system like Vanuatu, like, what are we going to do with all this stuff? So resource management, in a weird way, became a real priority there, in addition to all the clinical things we were seeing, all the wounds and broken bones and, you know, parasitic infections and respiratory diseases and diarrheal disease and all the rest of it. But that also gave me a great insight into, and again, this wasn't just me thinking this, it's me discussing this with my colleagues. Okay, well, what does the country need? We need doctors that can do a bit of everything. Where do we need them? Everywhere. So I started getting a few mates involved. They came and volunteered in Vanuatu, got out of Port Vila and went up to Santo and then to some of the outer islands. So yeah, Vanuatu has been a part of my life for a long time, and it was probably definitely the place in the Pacific where it became clearest to me that rural generalist model of medical care was the most sort of the single most effective sort of investment you could make in terms of training a clinician in that context.
Yeah, you also belong to Islam too,
you must have talked up Islam,
It's a language of Vanuatu, but I love the Pacific. It's my sort of where my heart is. But we've got to move on, Lockie. There's a lot to cover.
Yeah, right. Yep.
So tell me. So you've had this incredible experience. You've understood what the problem with the Pacific is. You've been to Vanuatu, which has got, frankly, one of the better developed systems of governance in the Pacific, but still obviously very lacking. What's next? What's next for you?
What's next for Rocket Ship? Or
No, you. Where do you go?
Well, I mean, I feel a bit guilty about this, to be honest, because, you know, after all this, pumping myself up as a hardcore rural doctor in Australia and then around the Pacific, I've now kind of largely left. Not completely. I still work as a rural doctor in Australia, heading out to Western New South Wales next week. Still on the board of directors of Rocket Ship, but my scope these days, it's fair to say, is a bit more global, and that's thanks to MSF. So again, shout out to the MSF crew who are here. So the role I have at MSF Operations Centre Geneva is Tropical Diseases and Planet, and it combines.
Okay, because we had a great dinner, and then you said, I'm off to, I think it was Angola. Mozambique, yeah. So you were off to Mozambique. Tell us about that week that followed. What was it like actually on the ground there?
Yeah, look, it was more like a month, because when I said it was available that time, I'm like, oh great, yeah, we'll have you, but you also need to be, medical team leader for a few weeks while you're there. So they all pissed off to Geneva and left me as the lead medical guy on the project. But it was fascinating because it was a project that I had helped set up late last year, and it is the first, I believe, in MSF's vast operational portfolio in 70-something countries to have planetary health as the headline. And it's a really interesting, I think, a really progressive strategic shift away from a kind of a vertical approach, disease-based approach, saying this is an HIV project or this is a tuberculosis project, saying this is a planetary health project, and they're sort of basically flipping the paradigm a bit to say, right, the diseases or the health problems that we're going to be addressing here are mostly familiar for both for the MSF teams and also for the Ministry of Health and also for the communities. Things like malaria, very much related to animals and the environment, very sensitive to changes in climate, and it's getting a lot worse. Same goes for cholera, same goes for other diseases spread by mosquitoes and water, and also this part of Mozambique is the most prone and most exposed in that part of the country to natural disasters, particularly cyclones. And in fact, one of the challenges we had getting the project going was they got smashed by several cyclones. And so the team had to get evacuated and the bridges were busted and the accommodation was flooded. But we finally kind of got it up and running. And so I went there for a few weeks just after I caught up with you. It was a real thrill to be part of the launch phase. So we went out and visited the clinics where we'll be working, where we're trying to implement, again, I mean, this sounds kind of obvious, like anyone here'd be like, oh yeah, well, you should do it like that. But we're trying to combine more closely the medical activities with the water, sanitation, hygiene teams' activities and the health promotion guys, so that you can be in the community saying, not the doctors and nurses saying, okay, we're here to see if you have malaria or you look like you got malaria, and then the water, sanitation, hygiene guys over there saying, we're going to do something about your mosquitoes, to bring all that together so that everyone is clear, including the community, about how these diseases occur, how to recognise and treat them, but also upstream how to prevent them or at least minimise the impact of it.
That sounds like preventative medicine, Lockie.
That's exactly what the project coordinator said, and it is a little bit of a sort of a cognitive shift for MSF, because I hope you guys, MSF crew, don't mind me saying this, but we are have a well-earned reputation as being great responders. And I guess for things like infectious diseases, when you have vaccination campaigns, that kind of thing, we definitely understand what public health and preventive medicine means, but it's not typically our top priority or the reason we go and do things. And I'm really proud of the organisation for kind of broadening the scope of our raison d'etre, the why we're there.
Sure. Look, Lockie, I want to bring you down to the personal somehow. I know your life is it's about that big picture, and that's where you are excelling. But it is in the end about people. And maybe one way I can do it. Look, have a look at that thumb. What do you reckon's happened there?
Looks like either trauma or a severe fungal infection.
It was a doctor ripped the bloody thumbnail off.
A doctor bit your thumbnail off?
No, ripped it off because there was an infection under it. I was stupid in the garden, wasn't wearing gloves, and this was only a week or two ago. I was in Melbourne and I was lucky enough to be able to go to work, casualty, and in hospital 48 hours, antibiotics and all the rest. Tell me what would have happened to me if I was a local bloke in Mozambique with blood poisoning from a very trivial accident I didn't even realise it happened. What's the outcome?
Well, it depends. I mean, if you can get access to medical care and they diagnose it correctly...
Let's say we can't.
Right, well, you're buggered.
Yeah. So like a stupid gardening accident can kill you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and in fact, I don't know whether you guys would remember this, but I had a very innocuous sort of coral cut in Fiji, and ended up with a leg the size of a Volkswagen bus, and I was like, serious risk of sepsis, gangrene, amputation here. So I basically went and forced my way into the hospital in Suva and told them what antibiotics I wanted. But if there's no hospital and there's no antibiotics and there's no doctor, then you're buggered.
So what does that do to you, Lachlan McIver, as a person when you see that? Because you see it all the time. We don't see it, but you do. What does it do? What? Just tell me about what it does.
Well, it goes back to your preface, Tim. It's about equity, and what really drives me, and this is the principle that was gently beaten into me as a child, is about you got to treat people fairly and equally, and it doesn't just bother me. It outrages me. It really distresses me and fires me up that kind of scenario doesn't just exist a bit. That is the situation for most people.
Yeah.
And so I feel like my raison d'etre, my thing that I can do and feel compelled to do, is do my bit to try and ensure that as many people as possible are able to avoid serious illness and injury and early death, and can access at least the basics of what health and medical care means. I'm a strong believer in the principle that healthcare is a human right. That means it's got to be available and has to be of sufficient quality and it has to be able to be sustained.
And so here we are, one person, a brilliant person, a compassionate and caring person, who is the weight of the entire injustice of the world's medical system on your shoulders. Really, that's what I've seen with you, Lockie. What happens? Sometimes you go off the rails, sometimes you just... None of us can cope with that sort of pressure.
Yeah, well, look, there's nothing special about me. I think...
No, that's a load of bullshit for a start, but get on with it anyway.
There's a lot of people out there seeing tough things and doing difficult work, right? And not just in health or medicine, but I understand where you're going with this, and I think it inevitably takes a toll. It's just a question of how much and in what form. And as you know, and as my family knows and people who read the book would know, I have been pretty messed up in terms of my mental health over the years and in fact in recent years. And part of that, big part of that, I guess, was this sort of sense of professional frustration and even, it might sound a bit weird to say, but a sense of a lack of purpose. Really trying to figure out, what am I doing with my life and how can I be most useful and effective. Might sound a bit pretentious, but it was a weight on my mind. But then combined with some very, very practical concerns like going bankrupt and not really seeing a way out of that horrible mess, feeling socially isolated, feeling really, really stressed and worried about rocket ship, for example, and being away from Australia, not being able to do clinical work, and then that interferes with one's relationships, of course. I went into this just horrendous vortex. I just went down the gurgler completely, and my poor mum and my sister get this phone call where I'm just incoherent. Huddled on the floor in the corner of a bedroom on the other side of the world, just completely broken. And I should have seen it coming, right? I'm trained as a bloody doctor. I should recognise the symptoms of depression, but I did not see it coming until I was just completely broken. So it takes a toll. Yeah.
Can I just say, Lockie, before we open to questions, that I know that feeling. I know where you're coming from. But sometimes we overlook the good we do, I remember when I was working in a pretty remote part of Papua New Guinea back in the early 80s, parents brought a young boy to me who'd broken one of his metatarsals and the bone was sticking up through the skin, and it was just a big pool of pus like that, with the bone sticking out. And I didn't. All I had was aspirin and vitamin pills, and I just said to the parents, look, unless you get this little boy to hospital, he's likely to lose his foot or he's going to die, And I gave them some money. That was the only thing I could do for an airfare. And then I forgot about it. And I went back to that area 20 years later and landed to do some work there, and this bloke came up to me and he said, do you remember me? And I said, no, I don't know you. There's always people in PNG, it's like try and tussle on, I said, no, I don't remember you. And he just pointed to his foot. I could see the scar, and that brought it all back.
Wow.
So, wow. So I said, what are you doing now? He said, well, I'm helping West Papuan refugees who are crossing the border all the time, because they need help. And I just thought, wow, that little investment I made of a few bloody $100 kina without thinking about it, was actually much more important than I imagined.
Yeah.
So I think maybe with what you do, probably it's 1,000 times bigger than that, in my view. But in any case, I just wanted to end on a more positive note, but maybe we can open now for questions. We've got about 20 minutes. I want to leave plenty of time for questions because I think that there will be a heap from the audience.
Thanks, Tim.
We'll hand over the microphone to anyone brave enough to ask a question. Can I just, maybe we can pass the microphone back?
Hi, I'm Jennifer. I'm the head of the MS MSF part of the fan club. I wanted to ask you a question, Lachlan. MSF has been really slow at coming to the table on climate. And I think a lot of us have felt the frustration, really happy that you're at the forefront of bringing us to where climate meets medicine in a really thoughtful and meaningful way. But what's really interesting is we actually sent out a message to our donors about how we're starting to work on climate, and you would have thought that we said something really awful. We got really strong reaction. And so I've been thinking about sort of the psychology of people, like the doctors within MSF who, are sort of old school and go, no, we just fix things. Or the people who want to give to us and just want to fix the thing in front of them. Do you think that this sort of mix of climate and medicine is too much for people to really think about? They want to do the short term because they know they're having impact. But the big, big picture of climate and health is a huge, tangled challenge for us. So I wanted to know if you have thoughts about that or what you've seen, how people have reacted.
Yeah, look, I'm sorry to hear that the reaction wasn't more positive, Jennifer.
There was positive too,
yeah,
don't get me wrong.
Yeah,
But
well, that's good to hear too. Look, I mean, Tim's been in the climate change game a lot longer than I have, and I think the tide is turning in terms of the level of public awareness of the issue and acceptance of the need to act, but we're still nowhere near the sort of critical threshold that we need. And my thoughts and my contribution, which I've tried my best to articulate in the book, are that pointing out the health impacts of climate change, I think has to be, I bloody hope it will be, one of the most effective ways to catalyse this action that we urgently need. I think a lot of people are labouring under the terrible misapprehension that climate change is some sort of distant, future, abstract threat that's probably not going to affect me and most people I know. That's bullshit. It is a very serious problem that is disproportionately, certainly, affecting people around the world. Some people are already being, very negatively impacted in terms of their health. I mean, this year's on track to be one of the hottest, if not the hottest, in recorded history. Worst wildfires ever in Western Europe. Things like heat waves and other types of natural disasters kind of crystallise these things in people's minds. But it's the slower burning, more insidious problems that I'm really trying to help bring to light. Not just the really obvious things like disasters or epidemics. Problems like air pollution is the number one killer in the world of anything, of any category. How much do you hear about that as a health problem? If you don't live in India or China. The way that we are degrading our environmental systems, oceans, forests, soil. Tim and I were talking about soil out there. It's not a particularly sexy topic for most people. Absolutely fundamental to all forms of life, basically on this planet anyway. I'm digressing a little bit, but just to say that I think making clear and repeating as often as necessary that climate change has very serious, almost universally detrimental impacts on human health now that are going to affect our parents and grandparents and children and grandchildren. If people don't care about anything else, if they don't care about the environment or they're too inappropriately worried about the economy, think about the health impacts. That's my message, and I think MSF, okay, better late than never, but they're kind of adding their very powerful voice to that conversation.
Great. Thank you. Sorry, I just... Yeah. Thanks so much. So I might have made a mistake giving away the microphone. Never do that when you're on the seat at the front, eh? But look, what I'll do if there's any more questions is paraphrase the question, and we'll go from there. So please, is there anything else?
Yep.
Here we go. Great.
Yeah,
thank you.
Obviously, I'm not going to let my kids read your book, Lucky, for a while. But what would you tell to that next generation? Is it the same message, or is it a different way to put it?
So the question is, it's been classified as AO or something even worse, this book. But what would we tell the next generation?
And you think this is adults only? You should have seen an earlier edition. Editors really cleaned it up. Gav, what would I say? Mate, I'd say sorry. We are at a point in history, and I use a couple of examples in the book, the most stark being Nauru, where this current generation has a shorter life expectancy than the previous one. Right? So since the Industrial Revolution, basically, lives have been getting longer. Maybe not universally better, but for any country untouched by war or HIV, Nauru is the first country, I believe, to have experienced a decrease in life expectancy, and that's because of the rise of chronic diseases, which is in large part related to these issues of planetary health. Basically, they're not trying to sound critical of the decisions of the Nauruan government of people, but they basically destroyed their country, and they're paying the price from a health perspective. There are other countries in the world that are also experiencing this tipping point now, the UK and the US among them, for different reasons, opioid epidemic, this kind of thing. But what we are doing to the planet, and thus doing to our health, means that the sort of legacy that we're passing on to our children is one that they would have a right to be, not particularly pleased about. So look, it's not too late, right? I know you've got kids, man. We've got to really think of them and lift our game, because we don't want to be going out or apologising and leaving the place in a worse state than when we found it.
Just to amplify on that question a little bit, I think humans are habitually, particularly blokes, are particularly late at coming to the party with things. I mean, look, I've been out there for years preaching to people we've got to act on climate change now before it gets really bad, because once it gets really bad, it's too late. And here I am doing that, actually, with my thumb getting worse over the last few weeks, thinking, it'll fix itself, it'll be all right. Until finally one night, 1 o'clock in the morning,
smart guy.
I couldn't sleep. That's why I finally go to the doctor and say, why do you wait so long to go? So, I don't know, Lockie, there's something about us that is slow. But I do hope that once we start to act as we are now, we can actually start making a difference in short order if we really commit to that change. Sorry, yes, we've got a question.
I'm just wondering, is rural and remote medicine kind of an outlier? I mean, this is really important, but from a policy perspective, is it being recognised? I mean, is it remunerated well? What do you think needs to happen from that policy perspective?
So the question is basically about rural and remote medicine. Is it prioritised appropriately or not?
It's a lot better now than it probably ever has been. So, I want to give credit where credit's due to the Australian College of Rural and Remote Medicine, also the Royal Australian College of GPs. Like, they have worked together to create the subspecialty discipline of rural generalist medicine, which is recognised, or in the process of being recognised by the Australian Medical Council. And there have been a lot of very valuable and appropriate political decisions and resource allocations over the last couple of decades to enable there to be a cohort of rural generalists built up in Australia who are now kind of onto their second or third generation. So I'm now old enough to be working alongside people I first knew as medical students who are now rural generalists, specialists, fellows of the Australian College of Rural Medicine in their own right. And it's great to see those guys come through. I'm like, bloody hell, you're really smart, well trained, that's great. There's still not enough, and it's not equal across the country in terms of where the states and territories are at by way of support for that training, having enough training places, having enough sort of funds for everyone to be able to do the work they want where they want. And I think there are issues that are very complicated and potentially intractable in terms of areas that very few people want to go and work or stay long term. So that's why sort of emerging or innovative solutions, like for example the service I'm involved in, the virtual rural generalist service in Western New South Wales, that was established because there were dozens of towns that just could not, for love nor money, get doctors to go and stay. And so we provide round-the-clock care through videos as the virtual doctors at the bedsides of these patients. And I'm not talking about, giving out Panadol for headaches. Like, we're running the resusces and dealing with the trauma and doing the palliative care and doing the whole shebang. It's not as good as having a doctor on the ground, but it's damn sight better than having no doctor at all. And I think it's going to be that kind of hybrid model that is going to be the, at least, partial solution to the rural health crisis in Australia. And what I'm really excited about is the sort of enabling an emergence of digital technology in, for example, Pacific Island countries, where we can start doing that kind of thing in other contexts. Again, learning from what we've developed by sheer force of necessity here in Australia. Yeah.
Great. That's a question.
Lachie, as evolved humans, we like to think that we have been able to learn from our mistakes. And we've seen many disasters here in Australia over the last few years. I have worked and lived in Vanuatu since I was 20 and was there just after Cyclone Pam as well, and saw the resource problem that you mentioned. I mean, if there's likely that another mega cyclone could hit Vanuatu again, just as an example. Do you think they have learned from that experience in 2015, where things would be better and we'd be able to do it better and things would change? I mean, have we learned from the mistakes after disasters where things have just completely unravelled?
The risk of sounding a bit glib, I think one of the greatest problems I have observed with humans is human nature.
I stand before it as an example.
We seem to have this kind of innate resistance to learning from history, and I have no idea why that is. We also seem to be, I'm like massively overgeneralizing here, right? But it's to illustrate a point. We also seem to be surprisingly resistant to collaborate. And in the context of a natural disaster, that is what makes the biggest mess, is that when you really need, more than ever, clear coordination and close collaboration, every organisation just wants to kind of do their own thing. And so one of the things that I'm sort of agitating for within my little piece of MSF is that we take a more sort of considered and data-driven approach to our disaster emergency preparedness and response, because we have looked a bit silly, quite frankly, in a few disaster responses over the years by even various MSF sections not cooperating and not communicating. So, I'm a proud MSFer. I love the organisation I work for. I'm not trying to shoot myself in the foot career-wise here, but I think even we need to kind of lead by example, and if we can use the vast pool of information that is out there, both historical information and just sources of real-time data, to be better prepared and able to anticipate and be more effective and precise in our disaster preparedness and response, then I think other organisations will benefit from that. The governments, who should be the leaders in these situations, will benefit from that, and ultimately, and most importantly, the communities should benefit from that. So yeah, we've got to kind of get around this problem of being ignorant or resistant to history and just like be more effective in our use of information.
Yes.
Thanks for tonight, it's been great. Not that I want to criticise anything, but I was lucky enough to pose this question to Eloise Mellons, one of my favourite Australian thinkers, who is the founder of Love Mercy. And I said to her, what does the government do, like funding-wise, assistance-wise? And she said, well, they don't interfere. So what are the various governments around the world doing to assist in making a change?
So
in your experience.
So the question is, what are the various governments in the world doing to assist MSF?
Any organisation, MSF is fabulous. I'm a donor, thoroughly support it. But any organisation that's trying to affect change, where are the various governments?
Broad question. Can you narrow it down at all?
Particularly the islands, that have limited resources.
Yeah. So what is the Australian government doing to assist the islands, really? Yeah.
Well, I mean, not enough, historically, as I'm sure you agree, Tim. And what I think it's really important to acknowledge, if we're talking about the Pacific region as an example, is to acknowledge that they have very good leadership and coordination themselves. And it is not for a country like Australia to be charging in and telling other countries what they need. This idea of partnership is absolutely critical, in my view, for effective development. It's hard to say what governments all around the world are doing to affect change, but to sort of try and respond to the question from a slightly different angle, I think the more collaborative and respectful governments can be between themselves, and the more contextualised the policies and recommendations can be to what the country actually needs, that is what is most effective. I think that change is happening too slowly in terms of the Australian government's aid and development program. It's sort of getting there eventually, and that's where it does get political, because every big or wealthy country has its own kind of agenda, and that's dangerous and often inappropriate, I think.
Could I just point out there as well, I mean, some of these countries aren't so small. So Papua New Guinea, for example, has a population of 8 to 10 million people. We have 25 million, so it's substantial. And I remember during the bushfires that Papua New Guinean people decided to do a fundraiser to help Australian farmers, and they raised $2.6 million from little villages around the country. Old men walked across mountain ranges with a handful of corn to give to their local member to pass on to the Australian farmers so they could grow a new crop. I mean, we don't hear enough about that. So a genuinely collaborative, equal partnership, the basis is there. But so many of us think of us as the great wealthy country and them as simply the recipients of our largesse.
Just as a quick postscript to that, I think the other risk in terms of sort of overseas development aid is that in addition to the developed country partner setting the agenda, they also see it in a very selfish way. Like, I've been in many conversations with the Australian government and its league of advisors about how to sort of strategise and prioritise development funding in Pacific Island countries in relation to health and climate change. And one of the most frustrating parts of that discussion for me is that it inevitably ends up having to be framed for purely political reasons as a security issue. Like, what the hell? That's just like, look, it shouldn't be the first thing that we care about risks to us. What about the just improving the health and lives of others for its own sake? Bloody hell.
Yeah. I think we're almost out of time. Lachlan McIver, I just want to say that reading your book and knowing you kind of, to me, you're a cross between Breaker Morant and Albert Schweitzer. You're right up as one of the great Australians. And I hope everyone reads the book and recommends it to other people. It's just such an important work. So thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you all again. Really appreciate you being here.